Chapter 13. The Home Rule Movement and its Fallout. The romantic adventure of the Ghnar revolutionaries was the dramatic response of Indians living abroad to the First World War. We now turn to the less charged, but more effective, Indian response, the Home Rule League movement, led by Lokmanya Tilak and Annie Besant. On 16 June 1914, Bal Gangadhar Tilak was released after serving a prison sentence of 6 years, most of which he had spent in Mandalay in Burma. He returned to India very different to the one he had been banished from. Aurobindo Ghose, the firebrand of the Swadeshi days, had taken sannyas in Pondicherry, and Lala Lajpat Rai was away in the United States of America. The Indian National Congress had yet to recover from the combined effects of the split at Surat in 1907, the heavy government repression of the activists of the Swadeshi movement, and the disillusionment of the moderates with the constitutional reforms of 1909. Tilak initially concentrated all his attention on seeking readmission, for himself and other extremists, into the Indian National Congress. He was obviously convinced that the sanction of this body, that had come to symbolize the Indian national movement, was a necessary precondition for the success of any political action. To conciliate the moderates and convince them of his bona fides, as well as to stave off any possible government repression, he publicly declared, "I may state once for all that we are trying in India, as the Irish Home Rulers have been doing in Ireland, for a reform of the system of administration and not for the overthrow of government, and I have no hesitation in saying that the acts of violence which had been committed in the different parts of India are not only repugnant to me, but have, in my opinion, only unfortunately retarded to a great extent the pace of our political progress." He further assured the government of his loyalty to the Crown and urged all Indians to assist the British government in its hour of crisis. Many of the moderate leaders of the Congress were also unhappy with the choice they had made in 1907 at Surat, and also with the fact that the Congress had lapsed into almost total inactivity. They were, therefore, quite sympathetic to Tilak's overtures. Further, they were under considerable pressure from Mrs. Annie Besant, who had just joined the Indian National Congress and was keen to arouse nationalist political activity, to admit the extremists. Annie Besant, already 66 in 1914, had begun her political career in England as a proponent of free thought, radicalism, Fabianism, and Theosophy, and had come to India in 1893 to work for the Theosophical Society. Since 1907, she had been spreading the message of Theosophy from her headquarters in Adyar, a suburb of Madras, and had gained a large number of followers among the educated members of many communities that had experienced no cultural revival of their own. In 1914, she decided to enlarge the sphere of her activities to include the building of a movement for home rule on the lines of the Irish Home Rule League. For this, she realized it was necessary both to get the sanction of the Congress, as well as the active cooperation of the extremists. She devoted her energies, therefore, to persuading the moderate leaders to open the doors of the Congress to Tilak and his fellow extremists. But the annual Congress session in December 1914 was to prove a disappointment. Feroz Shah Mehta and his Bombay moderate group succeeded, by winning over Gokhale and the Bengal moderates, in keeping out the extremists. Tilak and Besant thereupon decided to revive political activity on their own, while maintaining their pressure on the Congress to readmit the extremist group. In early 1915, Annie Besant launched a campaign through her two papers, New India and Commonweal, and organized public meetings and conferences to demand that India be granted self-government on the lines of the white colonies after the war. From April 1915, her tone became more peremptory and her stance more aggressive. Meanwhile, Lokamanya began his political activities, but, not yet having gained admittance into the Congress, was careful that he did not in any way alarm the moderates or appear to be bypassing the Congress. This is clear from the fact that at the meeting of his followers convened at Pune in May 1915, it was decided that their initial phase of action would be to set up an agency to enlighten the villagers regarding the objects and work of the Congress. The local associations that were set up in many Maharashtra towns in August and September of that year also concentrated more on emphasizing the need for unity in the Congress than on the stepping up of political activity. While sometimes resorting to threats to pressurize the more conservative among the moderates, Tilak still hoped to persuade the majority to accept him because of his reasonableness and caution. His efforts and those of Annie Besant were soon to meet with success, and at the annual session of the Congress in December 1915 it was decided that the extremists be allowed to rejoin the Congress. The opposition from the Bombay group had been greatly weakened by the death of Firoz Isha Mehta. But Annie Besant did not succeed in getting the Congress and the Muslim League to support her decision to set up Home Rule Leagues. She did manage, however, to persuade the Congress to commit itself to a program of educative propaganda and to a revival of the local level Congress committees. Knowing that the Congress, as constituted at the time, was unlikely to implement this, she had inserted a condition by which, if the Congress did not start this activity by September 1916, she would be free to set up her own league. Tilak, not bound by any such commitment, and having gained the right of readmission, now took the lead and set up the Home Rule League at the Bombay Provincial Conference held at Belgaum in April 1916. Annie Besant's impatient followers, unhappy with her decision to wait till September, secured her permission to start Home Rule groups. Jamnadas Dwarkdas, Shankerlal Bankar, and Indulal Yagnik set up a Bombay paper Young India and launched an all-India propaganda fund to publish pamphlets in regional languages and in English. In September 1916, as there were no signs of any Congress activity, Annie Besant announced the formation of her Home Rule League, with George Arundale, her theosophical follower, as the organizing secretary. The two leagues avoided any friction by demarcating their area of activity. Tilak's league was to work in Maharashtra, excluding Bombay City, Karnataka, the central provinces, and Berar, and Annie Besant's league was given charge of the rest of India. The reason the two leagues did not merge was because, in Annie Besant's words, some of his followers disliked me and some of mine disliked him. We, however, had no quarrel with each other. Tilak promoted the Home Rule campaign with a tour of Maharashtra and through his lectures clarified and popularized the demand for Home Rule. India was like a son who had grown up and attained maturity. It was right now that the trustee or the father should give him what was his due. The people of India must get this effected. They have a right to do so. He also linked up the question of Swaraj with the demand for the formation of linguistic states and education in the vernacular. Form one separate state each for Marathi, Telugu and Kannada provinces. The principle that education should be given through the vernaculars is self-evident and clear. Do the English educate their people through the French language? Do Germans do it through English or the Turks through French? At the Bombay Provincial Conference in 1915, he told B. Allur, who got up to support his condolence resolution on Gokhale's death, speak in Kannada to establish the right of Kannada language. It is clear that the Lokamanya had no trace of regional or linguistic Marathi chauvinism. His stand on the question of non-Brahman representation and on the issue of untouchability demonstrated that he was no casteist either. When the non-Brahmins in Maharashtra sent a separate memorandum to the government dissociating themselves from the demands of the advanced classes, Tilak urged those who opposed this to be patient. If we can prove to the non-Brahmins, by example, that we are wholly on their side in their demands from the government. I am sure that in times to come their agitation, now based on social inequality, will merge into our struggle. To the non-Brahmins, he explained that the real difference was not between Brahman and non-Brahman, but between the educated and the non-educated. Brahmins were ahead of others in jobs because they were more educated, and the government, in spite of its sympathy for non-Brahmins and hostility towards Brahmins, was forced to look to the needs of the administration and give jobs to Brahmins. At a conference for the removal of untouchability, Tilak declared, "If a god were to tolerate untouchability, I would not recognize him as God at all." Nor can we discern in his speeches of this period any trace of religious appeal. The demand for home rule was made on a wholly secular basis. The British were aliens not because they belonged to another religion but because they did not act in the Indian interest. He who does what is beneficial to the people of this country, be he a Mohammedan or an Englishman, is not alien. Alienness has to do with interests. Alienness is certainly not concerned with white or black skin or religion. Tilak's League furthered its propaganda efforts by publishing 6 Marathi and 2 English pamphlets, of which 47,000 copies were sold. Pamphlets were brought out in Gujarati and Kannada as well. The League was organized into 6 branches, one each in central Maharashtra, Bombay City, Karnataka, and central provinces, and 2 in Berar. As soon as the movement for home rule began to gather steam, the government hit back, and it chose a particularly auspicious day for the blow. The 23rd of July, 1916, was Tilak's 60th birthday, and, according to custom, it was the occasion for a big celebration. A purse of Rs 1 lakh was presented to him. The same day the government offered him their own present, a notice asking him to show cause why he should not be bound over for good behavior for a period of 1 year and demanding securities of 60,000 rupees. For Tilak, this was the best gift he could have wanted for his birthday. "The Lord is with us," he said. "Home rule will now spread like wildfire." Repression was sure to fan the fire of revolt. Tilak was defended by a team of lawyers led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He lost the case in the magistrates' court but was exonerated by the High Court in November. The victory was hailed all over the country. Gandhiji's Young India summed up the popular feeling, thus, "A great victory has been won for the cause of home rule which has, thus, been freed from the chains that were sought to be put upon it." Tilak immediately pushed home the advantage by proclaiming in his public speeches that home rule now had the sanction of the government, and he and his colleagues intensified their propaganda campaign for home rule. By April 1917, Tilak had enlisted 14,000 members. Meanwhile, Annie Besant had gone ahead with the formal founding of her league in September 1916. The organization of her league was much looser than that of Tilak's, and 3 members could form a branch, while in the case of Tilak's league each of the 6 branches had a clearly defined area and activities. 200 branches of Besant's league were established, some consisting of a town and others of groups of villages. And though formal executive council of 7 members was elected for 3 years by 34 founding branches, most of the work was carried on by Annie Besant and her lieutenants, Arundale, C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, and B.P. Wadia, from her headquarters at Adyar. Nor was there any organized method for passing on instructions. These were conveyed through individual members and through Arundale's column on home rule in New India. The membership of Annie Besant's league increased at a rate slower than that of Tilak's. By March 1917, her league had 7,000 members. Besides her existing theosophical followers, many others including Jawaharlal Nehru in Allahabad and B. Chakravarti and J. Banerjee in Calcutta joined the Home Rule League. However, the strength of the League could not be judged from the number of branches because, while many were extremely active, others remained agents of the Theosophical societies. In Madras city, for example, though the number of branches was very large, many were inactive, while the branch in Bombay city, the 4 branches in the UP towns, and many village branches in Gujarat were very active. The main thrust of the activity was directed towards building up an agitation around the demand for home rule. This was to be achieved by promoting political education and discussion. Arundale, through New India, advised members to promote political discussions, establish libraries containing material on national politics, organize classes for students on politics, print and circulate pamphlets, collect funds, organize social work, take part in local government activities, arrange political meetings and lectures, present arguments to friends in favor of home rule and urge them to join the movement. At least some of these activities were carried on by many of the branches, and especially the task of promotion of political discussion and debate. Some idea of the immensity of the propaganda effort that was launched can be gauged from the fact that by the time Annie Besant's League was formally founded in September 1916, the propaganda fund started earlier in the year had already sold 300,000 copies of 26 English pamphlets which focused mainly on the system of government existing in India and the arguments for self-government. After the founding of the League, these pamphlets were published again and, in addition, new ones in Indian languages were brought out. Most branches were also very active in holding public meetings and lectures. Further, they would always respond when a nationwide call was given for protest on any specific issue. For example, when Annie Besant was externed from the central provinces and Baral in November 1916, most of the branches, at Arundale's instance, held meetings and sent resolutions of protest to the Viceroy and the Secretary of State. Tilak's exterment from Punjab and Delhi in February 1917 elicited a similar response. Many moderate congressmen, who were dissatisfied with the inactivity into which the Congress had lapsed, joined the Home Rule agitation. Members of Gokhale's Servants of India Society, though not permitted to become members of the League, were encouraged to add their weight to the demand for home rule by undertaking lecture tours and publishing pamphlets. Many other moderate nationalists joined the Home Rule Leaguers in UP in touring the surrounding towns and villages in preparation for the Lucknow session of the Congress in December 1916. Their meetings were usually organized in the local bar libraries and attended by students, professionals, businessmen and, if it was a market day, by agriculturists. Speaking in Hindi, they contrasted India's current poverty with her glorious past and also explained the main features of European independence movements. The participation of moderates was hardly surprising, since the Home Rule Leagues were after all only implementing the program of political propaganda and education that they had been advocating for so long. The Lucknow session of the Congress in December 1916 presented the Home Rule Leaguers with the long-awaited opportunity of demonstrating their strength. Tilak's Home Rule League established a tradition that was to become an essential part of later Congress annual sessions. A special train, known variously as the Congress Special and the Home Rule Special, was organized to carry delegates from Western India to Lucknow. Arundale asked every member of the League to get himself elected as a delegate to the Lucknow session, the idea being quite simply to flood the Congress with Home Rule Leaguers. Tilak and his men were welcomed back into the Congress by the moderate president, Ambika Charan Mazumdar. After nearly 10 years of painful separation and wanderings through the wilderness of misunderstandings and the mazes of unpleasant controversies, both the wings of the Indian Nationalist Party have come to realize the fact that united they stand, but divided they fall, and brothers have at last met brothers. The Lucknow Congress was significant also for the famous Congress League Pact, popularly known as the Lucknow Pact. Both Tilak and Annie Besant had played a leading role in bringing about this agreement between the Congress and the League, much against the wishes of many important leaders, including Madan Mohan Malviya. Answering the criticism that the pact had acceded too much to the Muslim League, Lokmanya Tilak said, "It has been said, gentlemen, by some that we Hindus have yielded too much to our Mohammedan brethren. I am sure I represent the sense of the Hindu community all over India when I say that we could not have yielded too much. I would not care if the rights of self-government are granted to the Mohammedan community only. I would not care if they are granted to the Rajputs. I would not care if they are granted to the lower and the lowest classes of the Hindu population, provided the British government consider them more fit than the educated classes of India for exercising those rights. I would not care if those rights are granted to any section of the Indian community. When we have to fight against a third party, it is a very important thing that we stand on this platform united, united in race, united in religion, united as regards all different shades of political creed." Faced with such a stand by one who was considered the most orthodox of Hindus and the greatest scholar of the ancient religious texts, the opposition stood little chance of success and faded away. And though the acceptance of the principle of separate electorates for Muslims was certainly a most controversial decision, it cannot be denied that the pact was motivated by a sincere desire to allay minority fears about majority domination. The Lucknow Congress also demanded a further dose of constitutional reforms as a step towards self-government. Though this did not go as far as the Home Rule Leaguers wished, they accepted it in the interests of Congress unity. Another very significant proposal made by Tilak, that the Congress should appoint a small and cohesive working committee that would carry on the day-to-day affairs of the Congress and be responsible for implementing the resolutions passed at the annual sessions, a proposal by which he hoped to transform the Congress from a deliberative body into one capable of leading a sustained movement, was unfortunately quashed by moderate opposition. 4 years later, in 1920, when Mahatma Gandhi prepared a reformed constitution for the Congress, this was one of the major changes considered necessary if the Congress was to lead a sustained movement. After the end of the Congress session, a joint meeting of the two Home Rule Leagues was held in the same pandal and was attended by over 1,000 delegates. The Congress League Pact was hailed and the gathering was addressed by both Annie Besant and Tilak. On their return journeys, both the leaders made triumphant tours through various parts of North, Central and Eastern India. The increasing popularity of the Home Rule movement soon attracted the government's wrath. The government of Madras was the most harsh and first came out with an order banning students from attending political meetings. This order was universally condemned and Tilak commented, "The government is fully aware that the wave of patriotism strikes the students most, and if at all a nation is to prosper, it is through an energetic new generation." The turning point in the movement came with the decision of the government of Madras in June 1917 to place Mrs. Besant and her associates, B.P. Wadia and George Arundale, under arrest. Their interment became the occasion for nationwide protest. In a dramatic gesture, Sir S. Subramania Iyer renounced his knighthood. Those who had stayed away, including many moderate leaders like Madan Mohan Malviya, Surendranath Banerjee and M.A. Jinnah, now enlisted as members of the Home Rule Leagues to record their solidarity with the internees and their condemnation of the government's action. At a meeting of the AICC on 28 July 1917, Tilak advocated the use of the weapon of passive resistance or civil disobedience if the government refused to release the internees. The proposal for adopting passive resistance was sent for comment to all the provincial Congress committees, and while Berar and Madras were willing to adopt it immediately, most of the others were in favor of waiting for more time before taking a decision. At Gandhiji's instance, Shankerlal Bankar and Jamdas Dwarkdas collected signatures of 1,000 men willing to defy the internment orders and march to Besant's place of detention. They also began to collect signatures of 1 million peasants and workers on a petition for home rule. They made regular visits to Gujarat towns and villages and helped found branches of the League. In short, repression only served to harden the attitude of the agitators and strengthen their resolve to resist the government. Montagu, writing in his diary, commented, Shiva cut his wife into 52 pieces only to discover that he had 52 wives. This is really what happens to the government of India when it interns Mrs. Besant. The government in Britain decided to effect a change in policy and adopt a conciliatory posture. The new Secretary of State, Montagu, made a historic declaration in the House of Commons on 20th August 1917 in which he stated, "The policy of His Majesty's government is that of the increasing association of Indians in every branch of the administration, and the gradual development of self-governing institutions, with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire." This statement was in marked contrast to that of Lord Morley who, while introducing the constitutional reforms in 1909, had stated categorically that these reforms were in no way intended to lead to self-government. The importance of Montagu's declaration was that after this the demand for home rule or self-government could no longer be treated as seditious. This did not, however, mean that the British government was about to grant self-government. The accompanying clause in the statement which clarified that the nature and the timing of the advance towards responsible government would be decided by the government alone gave it enough leeway to prevent any real transfer of power to Indian hands for a long enough time. In keeping with the conciliatory stance of the Montagu Declaration, Annie Besant was released in September 1917. Annie Besant was at the height of her popularity and, at Tilak's suggestion, was elected president at the annual session of the Congress in December 1917. During 1918, however, various factors combined to diffuse the energies that had concentrated in the agitation for home rule. The movement, instead of going forward after its great advance in 1917, gradually dissolved. For one, the moderates who had joined the movement after Besant's arrest were pacified by the promise of reforms and by Besant's release. They were also put off by the talk of civil disobedience and did not attend the Congress from September 1918 onwards. The publication of the scheme of government reforms in July 1918 further divided the nationalist ranks. Some wanted to accept it outright and others to reject it outright, while many felt that, though inadequate, they should be given a trial. Annie Besant herself indulged in a lot of vacillation on this question as well as on the question of passive resistance. At times she would disavow passive resistance, and at other times, under pressure from her younger followers, would advocate it. Similarly, she initially, along with Tilak, considered the reforms unworthy of Britain to offer and India to accept, but later argued in favor of acceptance. Tilak was more consistent in his approach, but given Besant's vacillations and the change in the moderate stance, there was little that he could do to sustain the movement on his own. Also, towards the end of the year, he decided to go to England to pursue the libel case that he had filed against Valentine Chirol, the author of Indian Unrest, and was away for many critical months. With Annie Besant unable to give a firm lead, and Tilak away in England, the movement was left leaderless. The tremendous achievement of the Home Rule movement and its legacy was that it created a generation of ardent nationalists who formed the backbone of the national movement in the coming years when, under the leadership of the Mahatma, it entered its truly mass phase. The Home Rule Leagues also created organizational links between town and country which were to prove invaluable in later years. And further, by popularizing the idea of home rule or self-government, and making it a commonplace thing, it generated a widespread pro-nationalist atmosphere in the country. By the end of the First World War, in 1918, the new generation of nationalists aroused to political awareness and impatient with the pace of change, were looking for a means of expressing themselves through effective political action. The leaders of the Home Rule League, who themselves were responsible for bringing them to this point, were unable to show the way forward. The stage was thus set for the entry of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, a man who had already made a name for himself with his leadership of the struggle of Indians in South Africa and by leading the struggles of Indian peasants and workers in Champaran, Ahmedabad and Kedah. And in March 1919, when he gave a call for a satyagraha to protest against the obnoxious Rowlatt Act, he was the rallying point for almost all those who had been awakened to politics by the Home Rule movement. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Chapter 14. Gandhiji's early career and activism. When Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi called for a nationwide satyagraha against the Rowlatt Act in March 1919, his first attempt at leading an all-India struggle, he was already in his 50th year. To understand the man who was about to take over the reins of the Indian national movement and guide its destinies through its most climactic years, it is necessary to begin his story at least 25 years earlier, in 1893, when as a 24-year-old barrister, he began the struggle of Indians against racial discrimination in South Africa. The young barrister who landed at Durban in 1893 on a one-year contract to sort out the legal problems of Dada Abdullah, a Gujarati merchant, was to all appearances an ordinary young man trying to make a living. But he was the first Indian barrister, the first highly educated Indian, to have come to South Africa. Indian immigration to South Africa had begun in 1890 when the white settlers recruited indentured Indian labor, mainly from South India, to work on the sugar plantations. In their wake had come Indian merchants, mostly Memon Muslims. Ex-indentured laborers, who had settled down in South Africa after the expiry of their contract, and their children, many born in South Africa itself, constituted the third group of Indians that was in South Africa prior to Gandhiji's arrival. None of these groups of Indians had much access to education and certainly very little education in English. Even the wealthy merchants often knew only a smattering of English necessary to carry on their trade. The racial discrimination to which they were subjected, as part of their daily existence, they had come to accept as a way of life, and even if they resented it, they had little idea about how to challenge it. But young Mohandas Gandhi was not used to swallowing racial insults in order to carry on with the business of making a living. He was Thesan Ofa Devan, minister of an Indian state whose family, though in straitened economic circumstances, was widely respected in his native Kathiawad. Further, he had spent 3 years in London studying for the bar. Neither in India nor in England had he ever come in contact with the overt racism that confronted him within days of his arrival in South Africa. His journey from Durban to Pretoria, which he undertook within a week of his arrival on the continent, consisted of a series of racial humiliations. Apart from the famous incident in which he was bundled out of a first-class compartment by a white man and left to spend the night shivering in the waiting room, he was made to travel in the driver's box in a coach for which he had bought a first-class ticket, when he ignored the coach leader's order to vacate even that seat and sit on the footboard. He was soundly thrashed. On reaching Johannesburg, he found that all the hotels became full up the moment he asked for a room to stay the night. Having succeeded in securing a first-class train ticket from Johannesburg to Pretoria, after quoting extensively from railway regulations, he was almost pushed out again from his railway compartment and was only saved this humiliation by the intervention of a European passenger. On his arrival in Pretoria, where he was to work on the civil suit that had brought him to South Africa, he immediately convened a meeting of the Indians there. He offered to teach English to anybody who wanted to learn and suggested that they organize themselves and protest against oppression. He voiced his protest through the press as well. In an indignant letter to the Natal Advertiser, he asked, "Is this Christian-like? Is this fair play? Is this justice? Is this civilization?" I pause for a reply. Even though he had no plans of staying on in South Africa at that stage, he tried his best to arouse the Indians in Pretoria to a sense of their own dignity as human beings and persuade them to resist all types of racial disabilities. Having settled the lawsuit for which he had come, Gandhiji prepared to leave for India. But on the eve of his departure from Durban, he raised the issue of the bill to disenfranchise Indians, which was in the process of being passed by the Natal legislature. The Indians in South Africa begged Gandhiji to stay on for a month and organize their protest, as they could not do so on their own, not knowing even enough English to draft petitions, and so on. Gandhiji agreed to stay on for a month and stayed for 20 years. He was then only 25. When he left, he was 45. Gandhiji's experience in South Africa was unique in one respect. By virtue of being a British-educated barrister, he demanded many things as a matter of right, such as first-class train tickets and rooms in hotels, which other Indians before him had never probably even had the courage to ask for. Perhaps, they believed that they were discriminated against because they were not civilized, that is, westernized. Gandhiji's experience, the first of a westernized Indian in South Africa, demonstrated clearly, to him and to them, that the real cause lay elsewhere, in the assumption of racial superiority by the white rulers. His uniqueness in being the only Western-educated Indian also simultaneously placed on his shoulders the responsibility of leading the struggle of the Indians against increasing racial discrimination. Wealthy Indian merchants, senior to the 25-year-old barrister in experience and age, appointed him as their leader because he was the only one who could speak to the rulers in their own language, the only one who understood the intricacies of their laws and their system of government, the only one who could draft their petitions, create their organizations, and represent them before their rulers. The story of Gandhiji in South Africa is a long one, and we present it here in its briefest outline only to highlight the wide experience that Gandhiji had undergone before he came back to India. Gandhiji's political activities from 1894 to 1906 may be classified as the moderate phase of the struggle of the South African Indians. During this phase, he concentrated on petitioning and sending memorials to the South African legislatures, the Colonial Secretary in London, and the British Parliament. He believed that if all the facts of the case were presented to the imperial government, the British sense of justice and fair play would be aroused and the imperial government would intervene on behalf of Indians who were, after all, British subjects. His attempt was to unite the different sections of Indians and to give their demands wide publicity. This he tried to do through the setting up of the Natal Indian Congress and by starting a paper called Indian Opinion. Gandhiji's abilities as an organizer, as a fundraiser, as a journalist and as a propagandist all came to the fore during this period. But by 1906, Gandhiji, having fully tried the moderate methods of struggle, was becoming convinced that these would not lead anywhere. The second phase of the struggle in South Africa, which began in 1906, was characterized by the use of the method of passive resistance or civil disobedience, which Gandhiji named Satyagraha. It was first used when the government enacted legislation making it compulsory for Indians to take out certificates of registration which held their fingerprints. It was essential to carry these on person at all times. At a huge public meeting held on 11 September 1906, in the Empire Theatre in Johannesburg, Indians resolved that they would refuse to submit to this law and would face the consequences. The government remained adamant, and so did the Indians. Gandhiji formed the Passive Resistance Association to conduct the campaign. The last date for registration being over, the government started proceedings against Gandhiji and 26 others. The passive resistors pleaded guilty, were ordered to leave the country and, on refusing to do so, were sent to jail. Others followed, and their numbers swelled to 155. The fear of jail had disappeared, and it was popularly called King Edward's Hotel. General Smuts called Gandhiji for talks, and promised to withdraw the legislation if Indians voluntarily agreed to register themselves. Gandhiji accepted and was the first to register. But Smuts had played a trick. He ordered that the voluntary registrations be ratified under the law. The Indians under the leadership of Gandhiji retaliated by publicly burning their registration certificates. Meanwhile, the government brought in new legislation, this time to restrict Indian immigration. The campaign widened to oppose this. In August 1908, a number of prominent Indians from Natal crossed the frontier into Transvaal to defy the new immigration laws and were arrested. Other Indians from Transvaal opposed the laws by hawking without a license. Traders who had licenses refused to produce them. All of them were jailed. Gandhiji himself landed in jail in October 1908 and, along with the other Indians, was sentenced to a prison term involving hard physical labor and miserable conditions. But imprisonment failed to crush the spirit of the resistors, and the government resorted to deportation to India, especially of the poorer Indians. Merchants were pressurized by threats to their economic interests. At this stage, the movement reached an impasse. The more committed Satyagrahis continued to go in and out of jail, but the majority were showing signs of fatigue. The struggle was obviously going to be a protracted one, and the government was in no mood to relent. Gandhiji's visit to London in 1909 to meet the authorities there yielded little result. The funds for supporting the families of the Satyagrahis and for running Indian opinion were fast running out. Gandhiji's own legal practice had virtually ceased since 1906, the year he had started devoting all his attention to the struggle. At this point, Gandhiji set up Tolstoy Farm, made possible through the generosity of his German architect friend, Kallenbach, to house the families of the Satyagrahis and give them a way to sustain themselves. Tolstoy Farm was the precursor of the later Gandhian ashrams that were to play so important a role in the Indian national movement. Funds also came from India. Sir Ratan Tata sent 25,000 rupees, and the Congress and the Muslim League, as well as the Nizam of Hyderabad, made their contributions. In 1911, to coincide with the coronation of King George V, an agreement was reached between the government and the Indians which, however, lasted only till the end of 1912. Meanwhile, Gokhale paid a visit to South Africa, was treated as a guest of the government, and was made a promise that all discriminatory laws against Indians would be removed. The promise was never kept, and Satyagraha was resumed in 1913. This time the movement was widened further to include resistance to the poll tax of £3 that was imposed on all ex-indentured Indians. The inclusion of the demand for the abolition of this tax, a particularly heavy charge on poor labourers whose wages hardly averaged 10 shillings a month, immediately drew the indentured and ex-indentured labourers into the struggle, and Satyagraha could now take on a truly mass character. Further fuel was added to the already raging fire by a judgment of the Supreme Court which invalidated all marriages not conducted according to Christian rites and registered by the Registrar of Marriages. By implication, Hindu, Muslim and Parsi marriages were illegal and the children born through these marriages illegitimate. The Indians treated this judgment as an insult to the honor of their women, and many women were drawn into the movement because of this indignity. Gandhiji decided that the time had now come for the final struggle into which all the resistors' resources should be channeled. The campaign was launched by the illegal crossing of the border by a group of 16 Satyagrahis, including Kasturba, Gandhiji's wife, who marched from Phoenix settlement in Natal to Transvaal, and were immediately arrested. A group of 11 women then marched from Tolstoy Farm in Transvaal and crossed the border into Natal without a permit, and reached Newcastle, a mining town. Here, they talked to the Indian mine workers, mostly Tamils, and before being arrested persuaded them to go on strike. Gandhiji reached Newcastle and took charge of the agitation. The employers retaliated by cutting off water and electricity to the workers' quarters, thus forcing them to leave their homes. Gandhiji decided to march this army of over 2,000 men, women and children over the border and thus see them lodged in Transvaal jails. During the course of the march, Gandhiji was arrested twice, released, arrested a third time, and sent to jail. The morale of the workers, however, was very high and they continued the march till they were put into trains and sent back to Natal, where they were prosecuted and sent to jail. The treatment that was meted out to these brave men and women in jail included starvation and whipping, and being forced to work in the mines by mounted military police. Gandhiji himself was made to dig stones and sweep the compound. He was kept in a dark cell and taken to court handcuffed and manacled. The government's action inflamed the entire Indian community. Workers on the plantations and the mines went on a lightning strike. Gokhale toured the whole of India to arouse Indian public opinion, and even the Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, condemned the repression as one that would not be tolerated by any country that calls itself civilized, and called for an impartial inquiry into the charges of atrocities. The use of brutal force on unarmed and peaceful men and women aroused widespread indignation and condemnation. Eventually, through a series of negotiations involving Gandhiji, the Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, C.F. Andrews, and General Smuts, an agreement was reached by which the government of South Africa conceded the major Indian demands relating to the poll tax, the registration certificates, and marriages solemnized according to Indian rites, and promised to treat the question of Indian immigration in a sympathetic manner. Non-violent civil disobedience had succeeded in forcing the opponents to the negotiating table and conceding the substance of the demands put forward by the movement. The blueprint for the Gandhian method of struggle had been evolved, and Gandhiji started back for his native land. The South African experiment was now to be tried on a much wider scale on the Indian subcontinent. In other respects, too, the South African experiment prepared Gandhiji for leadership of the Indian national struggle. He had had the invaluable experience of leading poor Indian laborers, of seeing their capacity for sacrifice and for bearing hardship, their morale in the face of repression. South Africa built up his faith in the capacity of the Indian masses to participate in and sacrifice for a cause that moved them. Gandhiji also had had the opportunity of leading Indians belonging to different religions. Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and Parsis were all united under his leadership in South Africa. They also came from different regions, being mainly Gujaratis and Tamils. They belonged to different social classes, rich merchants combined with poor indentured laborers. Women came along with the men. Another aspect of the South African experience also stood Gandhiji in good stead. He learnt, the hardest way, that leadership involves facing the ire not only of the enemy but also of one's followers. There were two occasions on which Gandhiji was faced with a serious threat to his life. Once, when a white mob chased him down a street in Durban in 1896 and surrounded the house where he was staying, asking for his blood, he had to be whisked out in disguise. The second, when an Indian, a Pathan, who was angry with him because of an agreement he had reached with the government, assaulted him on the street. Gandhiji learned that leaders often have to take hard decisions that are unpopular with enthusiastic followers. South Africa, then, provided Gandhiji with an opportunity for evolving his own style of politics and leadership, for trying out new techniques of struggle, on a limited scale, untrammeled by the opposition of contending political currents. In South Africa, he had already taken the movement from its moderate phase into its Gandhian phase. He already knew the strengths and the weaknesses of the Gandhian method, and he was convinced that it was the best method around. It now remained for him to introduce it into India. Gandhiji returned to India in January 1915 and was warmly welcomed. His work in South Africa was well known, not only to educated Indians, but, as he discovered on his visit to the Kumbh Mela at Haridwar, even to the masses who flocked to him for his darshan. Gokhale had already hailed him as being without doubt made of the stuff of which heroes and martyrs are made. The veteran Indian leader noticed in Gandhiji an even more important quality. He has in him the marvelous spiritual power to turn ordinary men around him into heroes and martyrs. On Gokhale's advice, and in keeping with his own style of never intervening in a situation without first studying it with great care, Gandhiji decided that for the first year he would not take a public stand on any political issue. He spent the year traveling around the country, seeing things for himself, and in organizing his ashram in Ahmedabad, where he and his devoted band of followers who had come with him from South Africa would lead a community life. The next year as well, he continued to maintain his distance from political affairs, including the Home Rule movement that was gathering momentum at this time. His own political understanding did not coincide with any of the political currents that were active in India then. His faith in moderate methods was long eroded, nor did he agree with the Home Rulers that the best time to agitate for Home Rule was when the British were in difficulty because of the First World War. Further, he was deeply convinced that none of these methods of political struggle were really viable. The only answer lay in satyagraha. His reasons for not joining the existing political organizations are best explained in his own words. At my time of life, and with views firmly formed on several matters, I could only join an organization to affect its policy and not be affected by it. This does not mean that I would not now have an open mind to receive new light. I simply wish to emphasize the fact that the new light will have to be specially dazzling in order to entrance me. In other words, he could only join an organization or a movement that adopted non-violent satyagraha as its method of struggle. That did not, however, mean that Gandhiji was going to remain politically idle. During the course of 1917 and early 1918, he was involved in three significant struggles, in Champaran in Bihar, in Ahmedabad, and in Kedah in Gujarat. The common feature of these struggles was that they related to specific local issues and that they were fought for the economic demands of the masses. Two of these struggles, Champaran and Kedah, involved the peasants and the one in Ahmedabad involved industrial workers. The story of Champaran begins in the early 19th century when European planters had involved the cultivators in agreements that forced them to cultivate indigo on 3/20th of their holdings, known as the Tinkatia system. Towards the end of the 19th century, German synthetic dyes forced indigo out of the market, and the European planters of Champaran, keen to release the cultivators from the obligation of cultivating indigo, tried to turn their necessity to their advantage by securing enhancements in rent and other illegal dues as a price for the release. Resistance had surfaced in 1908 as well, but the exactions of the planters continued till Rajkumar Shukla, a local man, decided to follow Gandhiji all over the country to persuade him to come to Champaran to investigate the problem. Rajkumar Shukla's decision to get Gandhiji to Champaran is indicative of the image he had acquired as one who fought for the rights of the exploited and the poor. Gandhiji, on reaching Champaran, was ordered by the commissioner to immediately leave the district. But to the surprise of all concerned, Gandhiji refused and preferred to take the punishment for his defiance of the law. This was unusual, for even Tilak and Annie Besant, when externed from a particular province, obeyed the orders even though they organized public protests against them. To offer passive resistance or civil disobedience to an unjust order was indeed novel. The government of India, not willing to make an issue of it and not yet used to treating Gandhiji as a rebel, ordered the local government to retreat and allow Gandhiji to proceed with his enquiry. A victorious Gandhiji embarked on his investigation of the peasants' grievances. Here, too, his method was striking. He and his colleagues, who now included Brij Kishore, Rajendra Prasad, and other members of the Bihar intelligentsia, Mahadev Desai and Narhari Parekh, two young men from Gujarat who had thrown in their lot with Gandhiji, and J.B. Kripalni, toured the villages and from dawn to dusk recorded the statements of peasants, interrogating them to make sure that they were giving correct information. Meanwhile, the government appointed a commission of inquiry to go into the whole issue and nominated Gandhiji as one of its members. Armed with evidence collected from 8,000 peasants, He had little difficulty in convincing the commission that the Tinkatia system needed to be abolished and that the peasants should be compensated for the illegal enhancement of their dues. As a compromise with the planters, he agreed that they refund only 25% of the money they had taken illegally from the peasants. Answering critics who asked why he did not ask for a full refund, Gandhiji explained that even this refund had done enough damage to the planters' prestige and position. As was often the case, Gandhiji's assessment was correct and, within a decade, the planters left the district altogether. Gandhiji then turned his attention to the workers of Ahmedabad. A dispute was brewing between them and the mill owners over the question of a plague bonus the employers wanted to withdraw once the epidemic had passed, but the workers insisted it stay, since the enhancement hardly compensated for the rise in the cost of living during the war. The British collector, who feared a showdown, asked Gandhiji to bring pressure on the mill owners and work out a compromise. Ambalal Sarabhai, one of the leading mill owners of the town, was a friend of Gandhiji and had just saved the Sabarmati ashram from extinction by a generous donation. Gandhiji persuaded the mill owners and the workers to agree to arbitration by a tribunal, but the mill owners, taking advantage of a stray strike, withdrew from the agreement. They offered a 20% bonus and threatened to dismiss those who did not accept it. The breach of agreement was treated by Gandhiji as a very serious affair, and he advised the workers to go on strike. He further suggested, on the basis of a thorough study of the production costs and profits of the industry, as well as the cost of living, that they would be justified in demanding a 35% increase in wages. The strike began and Gandhiji addressed the workers every day on the banks of the Sabarmati river. He brought out a daily news bulletin and insisted that no violence be used against employers or blacklegs. Ambalal Sarabhai's sister, Anasuya Behan, was one of the main lieutenants of Gandhiji in this struggle, in which her brother, and Gandhiji's friend, was one of the main adversaries. After some days, the workers began to exhibit signs of weariness. The attendance at the daily meetings began to decline and the attitude towards blacklegs began to harden. In this situation, Gandhiji decided to go on a fast to rally the workers and strengthen their resolve to continue. Also, he had promised that if the strike led to starvation, he would be the first to starve, and the fast was a fulfillment of that promise. The fast, however, also had the effect of putting pressure on the mill owners, and they agreed to submit the whole issue to a tribunal. The strike was withdrawn and the tribunal later awarded the 35% increase the workers had demanded. The dispute in Ahmedabad had not yet ended when Gandhiji learnt that the peasants of Kedah district were in extreme distress due to a failure of crops, and that their appeals for the remission of land revenue were being ignored by the government. Enquiries by members of the Servants of India Society, Vithalbhai Patel and Gandhiji confirmed the validity of the peasants' case. This was that as the crops were less than 1/4 of the normal yield, they were entitled under the Revenue Code to a total remission of the land revenue. The Gujarat Sabha, of which Gandhiji was the president, played a leading role in the agitation. Appeals and petitions having failed, Gandhiji advised the withholding of revenue and asked the peasants to fight unto death against such a spirit of vindictiveness and tyranny, and show that it is impossible to govern men without their consent. Vallabhbhai Patel, a young lawyer and a native of Kedah district, and other young men, including Indulal Yagnik, joined Gandhiji in touring the villages and urging the peasants to stand firm in the face of increasing government repression, which included the seizing of cattle and household goods and the attachment of standing crops. The cultivators were asked to take a solemn pledge that they would not pay. Those who could afford to pay were to take a vow that they would not pay in the interests of the poorer ryots, who would otherwise panic and sell off their belongings or incur debts in order to pay the revenue. However, if the government agreed to suspend collection of land revenue, the ones who could afford to do so could pay the whole amount. The peasants of Kedah, already hard-pressed because of plague, high prices and drought, were beginning to show signs of weakness when Gandhiji came to know that the government had issued secret instructions directing that revenue should be recovered only from those peasants who could pay. A public declaration of this decision would have meant a blow to government prestige, since this was exactly what Gandhiji had been demanding. In these circumstances, the movement was withdrawn. Gandhiji later recalled that by this time the people were exhausted and he was actually casting about for some graceful way of terminating the struggle. Champaran, Ahmedabad and Kedah served as demonstrations of Gandhiji's style and method of politics to the country at large. They also helped him find his feet among the people of India and study their problems at close quarters. He came to possess, as a result of these struggles, a surer understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the masses, as well as of the viability of his own political style. He also earned the respect and commitment of many political workers, especially the younger ones, who were impressed by his identification with the problems of ordinary Indians and his willingness to take up their cause. It was this reservoir of goodwill and of experience that encouraged Gandhiji, in February 1919, to call for a nationwide protest against the unpopular legislation that the British were threatening to introduce. Two bills, popularly known as the Rowlatt Bills after the man who chaired the committee that suggested their introduction, aimed at severely curtailing the civil liberties of Indians in the name of curbing terrorist violence, were introduced in the Legislative Council. One of them was actually pushed through in indecent haste in the face of opposition from all the elected Indian members. This act of the government was treated by the whole of political India as a grievous insult, especially as it came at the end of the war when substantial constitutional concessions were expected. Constitutional protest having failed, Gandhiji stepped in and suggested that a satyagraha be launched. A Satyagraha Sabha was formed, and the younger members of the Home Rule Leagues who were more than keen to express their disenchantment with the government flocked to join it. The old lists of the addresses of Home Rule Leagues and their members were taken out, contacts established, and propaganda began. The form of protest finally decided upon was the observance of a nationwide hartal, strike, accompanied by fasting and prayer. In addition, it was decided that civil disobedience would be offered against specific laws. The 6th of April was fixed as the date on which the Satyagraha would be launched. The movement that emerged was very different from the one that had been anticipated or planned. Delhi observed the hartal on 30th March because of some confusion about dates, and there was considerable violence in the streets. This seemed to set the pattern in most other areas that responded to the call. Protest was generally accompanied by violence and disorder. Punjab, which was suffering from the after-effects of severe wartime repression, forcible recruitment, and the ravages of disease, reacted particularly strongly, and both in Amritsar and Lahore the situation became very dangerous for the government. Gandhiji tried to go to Punjab to help quieten the people, but the government deported him to Bombay. He found that Bombay and even his native Gujarat, including Ahmedabad, were up in flames, and he decided to stay and try and pacify the people. Events in Punjab were moving in a particularly tragic direction. In Amritsar, the arrest of two local leaders on 10th April led to an attack on the town hall and the post office. Telegraph wires were cut, and Europeans including women were attacked. The army was called in and the city handed over to General Dyer, who issued an order prohibiting public meetings and assemblies. On 13th April, Baisakhi Day, a large crowd of people, many of whom were visitors from neighboring villages who had come to the town to attend the Baisakhi celebrations, collected in the Jallianwala Bagh to attend a public meeting. General Dyer, incensed that his orders were disobeyed, ordered his troops to fire upon the unarmed crowd. The shooting continued for 10 minutes. General Dyer had not thought it necessary to issue any warning to the people, nor was he deterred by the fact that the ground was totally hemmed in from all sides by high walls which left little chance for escape. The government estimate was 379 dead. Other estimates were considerably higher. The brutality at Jallianwala Bagh stunned the entire nation. The response would come, not immediately, but a little later. For the moment, repression was intensified, Punjab placed under martial law, and the people of Amritsar forced into indignities such as crawling on their bellies before Europeans. Gandhiji, overwhelmed by the total atmosphere of violence, withdrew the movement on 18th April. That did not mean, however, that Gandhiji had lost faith either in his non-violent satyagraha or in the capacity of the Indian people to adopt it as a method of struggle. A year later, he launched another nationwide struggle, on a scale bigger than that of the Rowlatt Satyagraha. The wrong inflicted on Punjab was one of the major reasons for launching it. The Mahatma's Indian experiment had begun.